a mountain stronghold rising thousands of feet above the Indus gorges, wrapped in cloud. Local tradition held that no one could ever take it, not even Heracles, the mightiest hero of Greek legend, whom the Greeks described as a son of Zeus and slayer of monsters. The story said he had stood at its base and turned back, defeated. Now picture a 29-year-old king standing in that same spot, staring up into the same clouds. He has already conquered Persia. He has already conquered Egypt. Ancient writers claim that the oracle of Siwa, in the deserts of Libya, had hailed him, in their own religious language, as a son of Zeus Ammon. But to its defenders, this mountain did not care about titles, so Alexander the Great does something historians still argue over the exact details of. He sends thousands of his own soldiers into the forest with axes, ordering every man to cut 100 stakes apiece until the ground itself climbs toward the summit. What follows will bring panic, siege engines bombarding a fortress its defenders believed was beyond the reach of enemy weapons, and, in Arrian's account, a desperate retreat ending with men falling to their deaths on the precipices below. This is the siege that beat a legend. This is Aornos. By early 326 BC, Alexander the Great had already redrawn the map of the known world. He had shattered the Persian Empire at Gaugamela, burned his way through the mountain fortresses of Sogdia, and dragged his exhausted army across the Hindu Kush into a land the Greeks barely understood, India. But before he could face King Porus and his war elephants at the Hydaspes River beyond the Indus, one obstacle stood in his path, and it was unlike anything his engineers had ever encountered. It was not a walled city, it was not an army, it was a mountain. The Greeks called it Aornos. Its exact location has been debated by historians for over a century, and for a long time no one could even say for certain where on the map it had stood. Several candidate sites were proposed and argued over before the archaeologist Aurel Stein identified it, in 1926, with a mountain in northern Pakistan called Pirsar, a name that belongs to modern geography, not to the ancient sources. Other scholars, weighing the same ancient descriptions and the surrounding terrain, have argued instead for a different peak, Mount Elam, further to the west, and serious academic support for that alternative continues to this day. By modern surveying, Pirsar rises to roughly 7,000 feet above sea level, standing something like a mile above the Indus gorges below it, a scale ancient writers pushed even further, describing the rock's circuit and height in figures modern historians generally consider exaggerated. Whichever peak it actually was, its summit was a natural fortress, fed by its own spring, ringed on every side by cliffs so steep that the approaches appeared too formidable for a conventional besieging army to bring its engines within range. Arrian, drawing on the accounts of officers who marched with Alexander, tells us the local population believed that Heracles, the legendary ancestor Alexander claimed for himself, had once tried and failed to take this rock. Arrian himself seems to have viewed the story with some suspicion, noting that such tales had a habit of magnifying Alexander's achievements. Whether the legend was ancient truth, or a story sharpened for effect by his own chroniclers, its pull on the king was immediate. There may also have been a colder, more practical calculation behind the campaign. Aornos stood near Alexander's lines of communication back through the Hindu Kush, and it had just become a refuge for large numbers of refugees and fighters who had already resisted him fiercely at Massaga and Bazira. Leaving a hostile stronghold at his back while he pushed toward the Indus carried real risk, though the surviving sources themselves emphasized the refugees in the Heracles legend far more than any strategic calculation. Myth and possible strategy pointed in the same direction, and Alexander answered both at once. What followed would become, in the words of the historian Robin Lane Fox, the climax of Alexander's career as the greatest besieger in history. It would demand an engineering feat so audacious that his own men must have wondered if their king had lost his mind, sending an entire army into the timberlands with orders to cut stakes by the hundred, and building a mound of earth and timber toward a summit lost in the clouds. Men would work under repeated enemy attacks. An elite guard would scale the final cliffs by hand, hauling each other up in the dark. And in the chaos that followed, the ancient sources themselves cannot even agree on exactly what happened next. A genuine historical mystery we'll unpack when we get there. This is the story of the siege that even Heracles by legend could not win, and the mortal king who refused to accept that any mountain could stand against him. Before we climb into the clouds with Alexander's army, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. This channel exists to bring you the brutal, unfiltered truth of history's most impossible battles, and you will not want to miss what's coming. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Now, back to the Swat Valley, where Alexander was about to turn legend into a military objective. The winter of 327 BC found Alexander's army grinding through some of the most brutal fighting of the entire Asian campaign, and almost none of it is remembered the way Gaugamela or Issus is remembered. While the great set-piece battles against Persian kings made for legend, the harder war of Alexander's later years unfolded in the narrow, freezing valleys of the Hindu-Kush frontier against people who had no intention of submitting to Macedon. This was the Coffin Campaign, named for the Kabul River, a savage mountain war fought first against the Aspasyoi of the Kunar Valley, then the Gurayans, and finally the Asakanoi, a proud, warlike people who controlled the Swat Valley in what is now northern Pakistan. The fighting against the Aspasyoi shows just how costly this frontier war could be, even in its opening days. Arrian tells us Alexander stormed the first fortified Aspasian town he came to, and it was here, pressing the assault personally as he so often did, that a dart pierced his breastplate and wounded him slightly in the shoulder, one of several injuries Alexander personally suffered during this campaign. He captured the town regardless, the fighting spilling into the following day and pushed on to a neighbouring settlement called Andaka, which surrendered on terms rather than face the same fate. The wider Aspasian resistance eventually broke entirely, and Ptolemy's own account, as preserved by Arrian, claimed that more than 40,000 people were captured, along with a herd of cattle numbering, by that same account, well into the hundreds of thousands, animals so fine that Alexander reportedly intended to send some of them all the way back to Macedonia as working cattle for the fields. Pushing further into Gurayan territory, the army had to cross the swift Guraeus River itself, a crossing Arrian describes as genuinely difficult, not because of any enemy resistance, but because the current ran deep and fast, and the round, water-worn stones on the riverbed kept sending soldiers stumbling as they waded across. This was not a glamorous campaign of pitched battles and cavalry charges. It was a brutal, grinding occupation of hostile territory, river by river, valley by valley, tribe by tribe. The Asakanoi, further into the Swat Valley, were reported to possess tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, together with some 30 war elephants. Their greatest stronghold, Massaga, held out for days against the full weight of the Macedonian siege engines. Arrian records that Alexander himself took a slight arrow wound in the ankle during the assault. Later traditions add a colourful detail that Arrian never mentions, though even these traditions disagree with one another. Curtius says the city's ruler, a queen named Cleophas, later bore a son named Alexander, while explicitly leaving the identity of the father uncertain, but the Roman historian Justin went further and directly claimed Alexander himself was the father. Modern historians generally treat the whole story as a romanticised later tradition, since it appears nowhere in Arrian's more sober, contemporary-sourced account, but it shows how quickly legend began attaching itself to this campaign even in antiquity. When Massaga's Indian mercenary garrison finally came to terms, the ancient historians split sharply on what happened next. Diodorus describes a betrayal. The mercenaries surrendered under an agreed truce and were then slaughtered as they withdrew. Arrian tells a different story. The mercenaries had agreed to join Alexander's own army, then planned to slip away in the night, and were attacked while trying to desert. Either way, the result was the same. A mercenary force that had stopped actively fighting did not survive the encounter. The fortress of Aura fell soon afterward, taken at the first assault, and the Macedonians captured a number of war elephants there as well, left behind when the garrison's resistance ended. And at Bazira, another Asakenian stronghold, the defenders abandoned the city in the middle of the night rather than face a siege at all, once word reached them of Aura's fall, scattering into the hills. Word of what happened at Massaga spread through the valley, and it produced an effect Alexander had not fully anticipated. Rather than breaking the will of the Asakenians, it drove the survivors upward. Refugees and fighters from Massaga, from Aura, and from the abandoned city of Bazira climbed into the mountains, converging on the one place they believed no army could ever reach, a towering plateau the Greeks knew as Aornos. To understand why Alexander became so fixated on this single mountain, you have to understand what it actually was. Aornos was not a fortress built by human hands. It was a natural citadel shaped by geology itself, a summit with its own spring, enough timber to build with, and, according to Arrian, enough good arable land for as many as 1,000 men to cultivate. Ancient writers described its overall scale in figures modern historians generally consider exaggerated. What mattered on the ground was simpler. Every approach to that summit ran through cliffs steep enough that the terrain alone made the position seem unassailable, and it was here that myth wrapped itself around the mountain. According to the local tradition Arrian preserves, the population told the Macedonians that Heracles himself, the great strongman of Greek mythology, described by the Greeks as a son of Zeus, who had strangled the Nemean lion and dragged Cerberus from the underworld, had once come to this very mountain and failed to take it. Some modern scholars connect this story to an Indian Heracles the Greeks associated with Krishna, or possibly Balarama, figures worshipped in Indian religious tradition, since Greek writers had a habit of mapping foreign deities onto their own mythology wherever they travelled. That connection is a real scholarly hypothesis, not a settled fact. We don't know for certain whether the Aornos legend began as a genuine local tradition, or was shaped, even invented by Alexander's own court historians to justify what came next. Either way, its effect on the king was immediate and absolute. Because if there was one word in any language Alexander could not tolerate, it was failed. This was a king who had spent his life building a personal mythology in which he was not merely descended from heroes, but destined to surpass them. He claimed lineage from Heracles through his father's line and from Achilles through his mother's. He had already sacrificed at what he believed was Achilles' tomb at Troy. Ancient writers claimed that the priesthood of Zeus Ammon at the remote oasis of Siwa in the Libyan desert had hailed him, in their own religious language, as a son of Zeus Ammon, though even Arrian notes that the surviving accounts of exactly what happened there don't fully agree with one another. Every campaign had become, in his own mind, another chapter in a divine biography he was writing in real time. To hear that Heracles himself had once turned back from a mountain was not a deterrent. It was a challenge he could not leave unanswered. There may also have been a colder calculation beneath the myth. A hostile stronghold sitting near his lines of communication, filled with fighters who had every reason to hate him after Massaga, was a risk Alexander could not simply leave behind him, while he pushed toward the far greater confrontation waiting with King Porus across the Indus. Legend gave him his clearest motive. Strategy may have given him further justification. Together, they carried him north. So in the early spring of 326 BC, Alexander turned his war-hardened army toward a mountain that, according to local memory, had never once been taken by an invading force. The Asakenians who had fled there believed themselves finally safe, protected by altitude and by the reputation of a rock that even a hero whom Greek legend described as a son of Zeus had supposedly abandoned. They had no way of knowing that the man now marching toward them treated the word impossible as a personal insult. When you're travelling, you often have to rely on unfamiliar or public Wi-Fi, whether you're a Macedonian scout in hostile mountains or you're just checking in from a hotel on the other side of the world. That's why I use NordVPN whenever I'm on networks I don't control. It encrypts your traffic, making it much harder for anyone else on that network to snoop on what you're doing, and it can help you access your usual shows and services while abroad, subject to local laws and each platform's own terms. Head to the link in the description for a discount on a long-term plan, backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee. It genuinely helps support this channel, so if you've been enjoying the deep dives, that's the easiest way to back us. Now, back to the mountain, where an entire army is about to become a construction crew. When the Macedonian army arrived beneath Aornos in the early spring of 326 BC, Alexander's first move was not brute force. It was information. He needed to know exactly what he was facing before committing his men to a mountain that, according to local tradition, had never been taken by an invading army. So he did what he had done at nearly every difficult siege of his career. He found people who knew the ground. Local guides came forward, whether from surrender or self-preservation, and volunteered a rough path up the mountain's flank. Alexander left his trusted General Craterus behind with a portion of the army to manage supply and provisioning for what might become a long siege, then sent Ptolemy, son of Lagus, the same officer who would one day found a dynasty in Egypt, at the head of the Agrianians, other light-armed troops, and a detachment of picked hypaspists, with orders to seize a defensible position and signal his success with a beacon fire. Ptolemy's mission worked with real precision. Moving along a route Arrian describes as rough and difficult, his force occupied an advanced position without the defenders' knowledge, fortified it fast with a stockade and a ditch, and lit his beacon. Far below, Alexander saw the flame burning through the dark, proof that the first foothold on the mountain had been won. But the Indian defenders were not going to let this stand. As soon as they spotted the danger, they attacked Ptolemy's advance guard directly and separately moved to block Alexander's main force from linking up with him. What followed was 2 days of hard, grinding combat across broken, rising ground. Macedonian soldiers fighting for footing on terrain that gave every advantage to defenders who knew every path and outcrop on this mountain. It took 2 full days before Alexander's main army finally fought its way up to Ptolemy's position, and the 2 forces became one. Even united, the Macedonians still could not simply walk onto the rock itself. Between their position and the main plateau lay a natural obstacle that made a direct assault impossible. Neither historian preserves reliable dimensions for it. Diodorus calls it a chasm at the foot of the rock, while Arrian says only that the direct approach remained impracticable. What both accounts agree on is the effect. This was a natural barrier that no siege ladder or ramp of the kind Macedonian engineers had used at a dozen city walls could overcome conventionally. Every catapult, every stone thrower and dart thrower Alexander had brought this far into Asia sat useless on the wrong side of that barrier. The defenders on the summit could see the Macedonian army camped uselessly on the neighbouring high ground, and local tradition held that the terrain alone would finish what Heracles' legend had started. No army in living memory was believed to have overcome a barrier on that scale and brought siege engines within reach of the rock. They had simply never met Alexander of Macedon. Standing on that ridge, staring across a gap that should have ended the siege, Alexander did not order a retreat and did not look for another route. He looked at an obstacle generations of local memory had treated as final, and arrived at a solution so audacious it would force every soldier in his army, veterans of Gaugamela, Tyre, and the deserts of Persia included, to pick up an axe and start cutting the timber that would build a mountain of their own. Faced with a gap that had, for all practical purposes, stalled the siege, Alexander gave an order that would have sounded like madness from any other commander in history. Build the ground itself forward until it reached the enemy. Not a bridge suspended in the air, a solid, rising mound driven forward stake by stake until the terrain itself became his weapon. At dawn, Alexander ordered every soldier in his army, individually, to cut 100 stakes. Arrian is precise about this detail because it captures exactly how the operation worked. This was not a handful of engineers with specialized equipment, it was the entire army, phalangites and javelin throwers and officers alike, turned into a single coordinated labour force. From the top of the hill where they had camped, they began heaping up a mound, presumably combining the felled timber with whatever earth, brushwood and stone lay close at hand, though Arrian does not describe the internal structure in detail. What matters is the direction and the intent. The mound extended steadily toward the rock itself, built to bring Alexander's archers and catapults close enough to strike the summit directly. On the first day alone, the army drove the mound forward roughly the length of a stade, something in the region of 600 feet, a remarkable pace of progress, at least as Arrian presents it. Arrian tells us Alexander had done something similar before at Tyre, where his men spent 7 months building a stone causeway across open sea to reach an island fortress everyone considered unconquerable. The engineering method at Aornos was different, a mountain gap instead of open water. But the underlying philosophy never changed. Refuse to accept the landscape as a legitimate excuse for failure and simply outbuild the problem in front of you. The defenders did not sit passively and watch this happen. From early in the construction, Indian fighters launched repeated sallies against the exposed work parties, trying to disrupt the mound before it could reach them. Arrian records that Macedonian slingers and catapults, firing from the sections of the mound already completed, protected the builders and repeatedly defeated these attempts to halt the construction from the very first days of the work, not only once the mound was finished. This was grueling. Exposed labour on a narrow strip of ground above a real drop, sustained for several days under intermittent attack, a detail that needs no exaggeration to feel dangerous. Picture soldiers who had marched across deserts and crossed rivers under Persian arrows now doing something entirely different. Swinging axes from dawn until dark, hauling timber up a rising slope while watching for the next enemy rush against the exposed work parties, the gap between themselves and the enemy shrinking by the hour. By the fourth day, a small detachment of Macedonian soldiers made a sudden rush forward and seized a smaller hill positioned between the mound and the main rock, not the summit itself, but close enough that the defenders could see exactly what was coming. Alexander immediately drove the mound onward, aiming to connect it directly to this newly captured position. It was this final connection, more than anything before it, that seems to have broken the defenders' confidence. Watching Macedonian soldiers boldly seize ground they had assumed was unreachable, and watching Macedonian missile fire repeatedly defeat their own attempts to stop the work, the Indians on the summit understood that the mountain that had sheltered their ancestors for generations was no longer enough to keep them safe. By the time the mound connected to the captured hill, Macedonian slingers and engines had already been protecting the builders and repeatedly defeating enemy attempts to halt the construction, and the pressure on the defenders was cumulative rather than sudden. It's worth pausing here on something the ancient sources treat differently. Curtius preserves a vivid episode that does not appear in Arrian at all. He describes a direct Macedonian assault that was thrown back by the defenders, followed by 2 days and nights of celebration on the summit, the Indians beating drums and shouting in triumph, apparently convinced they had won. Arrian's version skips straight from the completed approach to the defenders losing their nerve and opening negotiations. We can't fully reconcile the two accounts, but Curtius's episode, even if it isn't in Arrian, captures something true about the psychology of this siege. Defenders who had long believed their position genuinely unreachable, suddenly forced to reckon with the possibility of defeat, and for a brief moment, believing they had escaped that fate after all. According to Arrian's sequence, the defenders soon sent a herald down to Alexander with an offer. They were willing to surrender the rock if he would grant them a truce. On its face, this looked like the end of the siege, but Alexander, by this stage of his career, understood siege warfare and human desperation about as well as anyone alive, and he seems to have suspected the offer wasn't entirely sincere. He was right to be suspicious. While negotiations were underway, the defenders quietly began preparing to abandon the rock under cover of night, hoping to slip away through the guard positions Alexander had placed around the mountain before the trap could close completely. When Alexander discovered what they were planning, he made a calculated and, in hindsight, ruthless decision. Rather than stopping them immediately, he deliberately allowed the withdrawal to begin, pulling back his encircling guard posts and letting the defenders think their escape was working. He waited until the retreat was already underway. Then he personally led 700 men, drawn from his royal bodyguards and the elite Hippaspists, the same shield-bearing unit that had spearheaded his most dangerous assaults from the Balkans to Bactria, up to the section of the rock the fleeing defenders had just abandoned. Alexander himself climbed first, with his men following after him at multiple points, pulling each other up hand over hand wherever the ascent was hardest. At a prearranged signal, this small force turned on the retreating Indians below them. Arrian's account describes real chaos in what followed. Many defenders were killed as the Macedonians caught them in flight, while others, gripped by panic, ran for the cliff edges they knew and fell to their deaths trying to escape rather than turn and fight. It's worth being honest here about something the ancient sources themselves disagree on. Arrian, who generally preferred accounts connected with Alexander's companions in the campaign, describes this violent final clash on the retreat. Diodorus, writing from a different tradition centuries later, tells an entirely different story. That Alexander used deception rather than force, deliberately opening an escape route to let the defenders flee, and took the empty rock without any final fighting at all. Two ancient historians drawing on different source traditions, giving two different endings to the same siege. We may never know for certain which version is closer to what actually happened on that mountain. What both traditions agree on is the outcome. When the operation was over, Aornos belonged to Alexander. He walked a summit believed, by local tradition, never to have been occupied by an invading force before his. Arrian tells us simply that he offered sacrifice there. Curtius adds a further detail that Alexander raised altars dedicated to Athena and to victory, a deliberate act declaring that he had succeeded where his own claimed ancestor Heracles was said to have failed. Alexander arranged a garrison to hold the position permanently, placing it under the command of a man named Sisycotus, an Indian officer with a genuinely unusual backstory. He had originally deserted from his own people to serve Bessus, the former Bactrian satrap who had gone on to claim the Persian kingship for himself, and only later, once Bessus had been defeated, transferred his loyalty to Alexander, where he proved reliable enough to be trusted with one of the most strategically important garrisons in the entire Eastern campaign. Alexander did not linger. He pushed on into the surrounding country, hoping to seize the war elephants the defeated Indians had left behind. He learned that the population had fled for safety to a local ruler named Abyssares, but that their elephants had simply been left to graze near the Indus. Alexander sent experienced Indian elephant hunters after the herd and succeeded in capturing most of the animals, adding them to his own growing collection of war elephants. With that final piece of unfinished business behind him, Alexander turned his army toward the Indus itself, where his generals Hephaestion and Perdiccas had already constructed a bridge of boats across the river. When Alexander arrived at the crossing, he found gifts waiting from the Indian ruler Taxiles, who had already submitted to Macedonian authority: silver, thousands of cattle and sheep for sacrifice, war elephants, and several hundred additional cavalry to reinforce the army. Alexander paused there just long enough to offer sacrifice and hold athletic games for his men before crossing the river toward the far bloodier confrontation waiting for him on the banks of the Hydaspes against King Porus and his war elephants. Aornos itself would fade quickly from prominence in the wider story of Alexander's campaigns, overshadowed by everything that came after. But for the men who cut down thousands of stakes to build a road toward an unreachable summit, and who climbed a supposedly unconquerable cliff by hand rather than accept defeat, it remains, without needing any exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary engineering and military achievements of the ancient world. What happened on that mountain in the spring of 326 BC tells us something about Alexander the Great that a battle against Darius or Porus never could. Gaugamela was about defeating an empire. Aornos was about defeating an idea. The idea that geography and legend together can draw a line no ambition is allowed to cross. Alexander looked at a mountain that local tradition said had humbled Heracles himself, and his answer was not caution. It was to send his entire army into the forest with axes and prove that the only truly impregnable fortress is the one defended purely by the belief that it cannot be taken. The human cost underneath that victory is easy to miss beneath the engineering spectacle. The people who fled to Aornos were refugees and fighters who had escaped from Massaga, Aura, Bazira, and the surrounding settlements, climbing higher and higher, searching for the one place left where the war might not follow them. They found that place, held it through days of desperate fighting and construction, and then watched it fail them when it mattered most, whether through Arrian's violent final struggle on the cliffs, or Diodorus's quieter story of a rock taken by deception rather than force. Even the historians who preserved this story, writing generations and centuries after the events themselves, couldn't fully agree on how it ended, which tells you something honest about how quickly even testimony passed down through respected sources can blur into legend. It's an instinct that appears again in the next episode Arrian inserts into his narrative, at a town called Nysa, where local leaders told Alexander their city had been founded by Dionysus, a figure worshipped in ancient Greek religion after his own legendary conquest of India. Arrian suggests Alexander was happy to encourage the story, since it conveniently placed his own campaign in the footsteps of Dionysus, a figure of Greek religion and legend whose conquests he could now claim to have matched or surpassed. He rode up the nearby mountain with his officers to crown themselves with ivy in Dionysus's honour. On this campaign, it seems, myths about the heroes and legendary predecessors Alexander claimed as his own kept finding him at every turn, and Aornos was simply the moment that mattered most. The mountain itself did not stay found. For more than 2,000 years after Alexander's army marched away, the exact location of Aornos remained one of the great open questions of classical geography, with several candidate sites proposed and debated by generations of scholars working from the conflicting ancient descriptions preserved by Arrian, Diodorus, Curtius, and later geographical writers. It wasn't until 1926 that the archaeologist Orlstein, determined to retrace Alexander's Indian campaign step by step, climbed to the summit of a remote highland spur the local Gujar herdsmen called Pir Sar, the holy man's height. Standing on that plateau, Stein found a spring, cultivable land, and a natural approach that matched Arrian's account closely enough to convince him he had found Alexander's mountain. His identification remains the best-known modern proposal, although the case for Mount Elam continues to receive serious scholarly support, and the debate has never fully closed. Alexander himself never seems to have weighed the human cost of Aornos the way we might today. For him, the siege was another line on a longer, grander ledger, proof he was not merely a king but something closer to the ancestors he claimed. Within months he would be facing Porus at the Hydaspes, and within a few short years his own body would fail him in Babylon. At only 32 years old, his vast conquests barely consolidated, and another campaign already being prepared when death overtook him. But Aornos remained, for the men who marched with him, for the historians who wrote it down generations later still disagreeing on how it ended, and for the explorer who finally went looking for the mountain again after 2,000 years of silence. Proof of exactly who Alexander was. A man who treated the word impossible as a personal insult, and who sent an army into the forests with axes and climbed a cliff in the dark, rather than let a legend stand unchallenged. If stories like this one, the ones that dig past the famous battles into the brutal, complicated reality of ancient warfare, are the reason you keep coming back to this channel, consider joining as a channel member. Members get early access to new uploads before they go public, behind-the-scenes looks at how these scripts and visuals come together, and a direct hand in choosing which battles and sieges we tackle next. It's a small way to support the deep research that goes into every single one of these videos, and it makes a real difference in keeping this channel growing. Hit that join button below the video, and thank you for spending this time on Aornos with me. I'll see you in the next one.